Hello, good day to everyone. Good day to all the participants joining. Today we will be talking about the 21st century reset, human development, volunteering, and the new social contract. So it's time for a global reset. The pandemic has given us an opportunity to reshape our relationships with people and the planet and chart a bold new path for sustainable development. But what would a new social contract look like that better secure the rights and dignity for all while respecting the planetary boundaries? And what is the role of volunteerism in this global reset? So today in this dialogue, we will look at how to promote inclusive human development, protect the planet, and provide a pathway to a new social contract between citizens and states, and what is the role of volunteerism in all of this. Today, we are very lucky and very grateful to be joined by a number of speakers and panelists, starting with our Executive Coordinator from the United Nations Volunteers, Mr. Toily Korbanov, and the Director of the Human Development Report Office, who is our co-host, Mr. Pedro Concepcion, who will also give their opening remarks. Afterwards, Mr. Chris Melora, who's the lead researcher for the State of the World's Volunteerism Report, and Ms. Emma Morley, the Chief of Volunteer Advisory Services of UN Volunteers, will frame the whole conversation today. And then in the second half of this webinar, we would hear from government, from UN and academia on talking about the different aspects of the social contract and models for volunteerism. And we will be joined here by Ms. Cielo Morales, who is the Director of Instituto Latinoamericano del Caribe de Planificación Económica y Social, Mr. Jacob Ellis, who's the Lead Changemaker Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, Ms. Christina Lengfelder, the Senior Research Analyst of the Human Development Report Office, Ms. Il-Trong Yi, who's the Senior Research Coordinator for the Research Institute for Social Development of the United Nations. And of course, this will not be complete without the powerful voices of the social movements and volunteers from different regions. We will be joined by Ms. Jalil Ann Borao, who's the co-founder of the Citizen Budget Tracker in the Philippines, Ms. Winarin Litutano, who's the co-founder of Thailand Clean Air, Ms. Cristina Colo, who's a climate activist and social entrepreneur from Madagascar, and Ms. Nada Nafes, who is a UN volunteer from the World Health Organization Regional Office. So with that, let's hear from Mr. Toily Korbanov, who will give us your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Katrina. It's a great privilege to be here at this webinar together with Pedro Concepcion and the panel of distinguished speakers. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending from where you're connected throughout the world. Look, colleagues, COVID is already making impact on the social contracts across the globe. In some countries, the massive interventions during 2020 are revitalizing the social contracts. We're seeing this in the government spending for affordable services, in the renewed discussions around the universal healthcare coverage, and in temporary basic income discussions. In other countries, the fragile social contracts are being endangered. The demand for social protection has gone up, while the capabilities of the governments to deliver on the social protections have been diminished. Today, we're seeing the public protests against the lockdown. Tomorrow, they might be about accessing the vaccines. Is it possible that COVID will help reset the social contracts? The answer is yes, if the public spending will better target the most vulnerable, and if there will be systemic role for the private sector. But the answer could be no, if important voices will be excluded. According to UNDP and UN Women Gender Tracker, women are 70% of the global healthcare workers, but only 24% of the members of the government's task forces working on COVID response around the world. Will the new social contracts recognize the role of the volunteering? Yes, if you look at UNV and other organizations' experiences during the pandemic. Volunteers led awareness campaigns, detected misinformation, provided groceries to the elderly, and ran health plans for the most vulnerable in so many countries. But the answer could be also no. If you see that the global discourse on volunteering has not evolved during the pandemic, in fact, it hasn't evolved much over the last 50 years. It is still around the notions of help and volunteers as implementers. We must move beyond this generic rhetoric. We should describe models of volunteering in the world, measure their contributions to human development, and understand the role the volunteerism is playing and can play in resetting the social contracts. UNV took upon itself to explore volunteering models that enable people and states to work together. The next report on the state of the world volunteerism will document the experiences of the policymakers and of the volunteer communities, and look how volunteering can drive fairer norms, decisions, and actions. I see three challenges to resolve if the report were to add value to the member states and to the international community at large, and to move forward the global discourse. First, we need to unpack the big concepts of volunteering for human development, crystallize its parameters, and understand what they mean in different contexts, as well as to highlight the concerns of the policymakers, of the volunteers, and of the other stakeholders. Second, we need to draw a balanced picture. Where do the various volunteering models live up to the promise of human development and resetting the social contracts? And where do they not, particularly when it comes to helping those who are furthest behind? And third, we need the report to come up with ideas. The ideas that will not stay in the report, but will go live in action, which means that we need to focus less on a publication and more on the process of co-production for improved knowledge and evidence. But UNV is just one organization. We need allies, policymakers, practitioners, academia, and the volunteers. Your individual and collective commitment and capacities. And this online dialogue is a first step in forming the coalition of the like-minded partners who will help to frame the 21st century reset, human development, volunteering, and the social contract. UNV already counts amongst its allies the Human Development Report Office, led by Pedro Conceição. The Human Development Reports by HDRO carry a lot of influence in the global development debate. I am a big fan of Pedro and his team and the work that they're doing, and I look forward to learning from him and from other distinguished panelists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Toily, for that very provocative remarks. So now I'm handing over to Mr. Pedro Conceição for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Katrina. Toily, we are fans of your leadership, also your wonderful team at UNV, and we are delighted to be co-hosting the dialogue today. I'm also happy that my colleague Christina will participate in the dialogue a little later today. So I just wanted to take this opportunity. You mentioned human development reports, Toily. Last year we published, we celebrated the 30 years since we started publishing the Human Development Report. And I would just like to briefly highlight three of the key messages of the report to provide some elements that will hopefully be helpful in the dialogue today, and perhaps more importantly in the process of producing your own report, which will continue over the coming weeks and months. So the first message is that as we continue to confront COVID-19, which you alluded to, Toily, but as we face also the climate emergency, the 2020 Human Development Report offers a perspective under which these challenges are not seen as separate problems, but rather as reflections of an unprecedented moment in our history and the history of our planet. This is a time when human pressures on the planet are driving dangerous planetary change for us, but also for all life on the planet. This is a time that has been described as a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, and it's in its essence characterized by the emergence of new risks that result from the fact that, as the UN Secretary General put it late last year, humanity seems to be waging a war on nature. Now, the second message is that we are not only facing new risks, but that they are superimposed in a world that has large inequalities. And sometimes these inequalities are actually exacerbated by these risks. You alluded already to the impact on gender inequalities. In this slide, you can see that the pattern actually holds more broadly. It's not only about COVID-19, but countries that face more ecological threats, droughts, floods, and storms, are also those where gender inequality is higher. But if you consider inequality in human development more broadly, the story is actually the same, as you can see on the second chart on this slide. Now, inequalities are also linked to gaps in consumption and power. We know that some over-extract and over-pollute, while others bear the consequences. In the report, we highlight that by the end of this century, the poorest countries in the world, represented in this chart at the left-hand side of the horizontal scale, who have contributed the least to climate change, could actually experience up to 100 days more of extreme temperature by the end of the century, while rich countries, which have historically contributed the most, could actually experience 18 days less. But these 100 days could be cut in half if we were to get close to meeting the aspirations of the Paris Agreement, as the blue lines on this chart show. So what happens going forward is really not inevitable and depends on our choices. And this brings me to the third key message of the report. Human development is often seen as being a way of looking at people's well-being, and it is that. But it's also about seeing people as agents of change. And so this gives, this calls for giving people conditions to make different choices. In the 2020 HDR, we supplemented Human Development Index with a new index of planetary pressures that combines indicators of material footprint per person and carbon dioxide per capita. If we plot the current values of these two indices for all countries in the world in a two-dimensional graph that you see on the screen, we see that the aspirational space of high human development and low planetary pressures, represented by the triangle that is flashing, is now empty. The dots represent the positions of countries today. And to take us there, the report lays out three mechanisms to encourage people to make different choices. The first is about using prices and regulation to shift economic incentives. Carbon prices and the removal of fossil fuel subsidies are examples. But the report emphasizes also the importance of incentives and investments in research, technology, and innovation to continue to expand the frontier of knowledge. Second, we suggest the importance of looking at nature not as a constraint, but as a potential opportunity in advancing human development. By protecting and restoring ecosystems. This includes protecting and restoring forests or investing in the blue economy of our oceans, for instance. These are examples that show how preserving ecosystems integrity can also provide long-lasting economic and human development opportunities. Now, I'll conclude with the third element that we emphasized in the report, which is this idea of harnessing social norms. I think this is perhaps particularly important to take further in the discussions and the deliberations today. Because much policy analysis is premised on the idea that each person is an island making rational calculations on how to behave. But we know that humans are actually an ultra-social species, and the key predictor of what people do is what others around them do and expect them to behave, the way in which they expect them to behave. So social norms can change quickly. We've seen that they can change when it comes to the use of masks, for instance. We suggest in the report that we must harness social norms to give greater weight to easing planetary pressures. We emphasize in the report the role of education in particular. Education here broadly understood to enhance a sense of stewardship for nature, but also the critical thinking that is so important for reasoned public and individual deliberation. In today's dialogue, hopefully we'll dig a little bit deeper in the role of volunteering in shifting social norms. Social norms are sometimes described as a bridge between values and action. But people that engage in voluntary activities are already building those bridges, not only because they are already acting according to their values, but also because they're inspiring others to do so. So Toily, here, I think that this broader reflection on the role of volunteering in advancing human development, but also in the context of what we found in the 2020 Human Development Report, easing planetary pressures, suggests that volunteering can indeed make a decisive contribution in shifting social norms to encourage the behavior that is needed to move us in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for that very encouraging, empowering remark by emphasizing that we individuals have the capacity or the power to change things. And again, to everyone watching who are just joining now, we just had the opening remarks from Mr. Toily Kobanov and Pedro Conceição. And now we are moving on to the next part of this webinar. And I'm passing over to Ms. Emma Morley and Mr. Chris Melora, who will present about the volunteerism and the new social contract. Over to you.
Thank you, Katrina, and thanks to Pedro for your great introductory remarks. Firstly, I'd like to talk a bit about the framing of the State of the World's Volunteerism Report. And the framing is set within our overarching framework that we're all working towards, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. You will recall that back in 2015, the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs assigned significant roles to all stakeholders in the shaping, prioritization, implementation, and review of development processes, including for volunteers. And the underlying principles of the 2030 Agenda stress the need for inclusion of those groups furthest behind, not only in terms of their needs, but also to enable all groups and individuals to participate, to have their voices and perspectives considered and heard, and also most importantly, responded to by their member states and others. Back in 2015, no one could have anticipated the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic, and indeed the global crisis it has created, presents a challenge, but also an opportunity for us to design resilient and inclusive relationships between people and states, and to look at the role of voluntary actions and of volunteers. Moving on to the next slide, let us look at where we are in terms of the quality of people's engagement. A 2020 report by UNDESA shows that 5 years into the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, country strategies to engage stakeholders are still at an early stage and are sometimes partial or even superficial. We have seen the scale up of information sharing and consultation mechanisms across all contexts. Top-down collaboration with implementing stakeholders is also happening. But people's meaningful involvement in decisions, although improving since 2015, still falls far behind. Investments in systems and structures to empower people to partner with their states and other actors is also limited. Furthermore, a newly released publication this month from UNDESA and our colleagues at UNDP suggests that the COVID-19 pandemic has added to this challenge. The report suggests that governments may have fewer resources or dedicate less attention for engaging stakeholders, while at the same time, dialogue between authorities and people is more important than ever to agree on how to build a fairer society going forward. So let's look a bit, let's focus in on the next slide on the role of volunteers. So let's ask ourselves whether volunteering can fill these gaps in improving quality engagement. However, if we focus actually on the volunteer stakeholders, we see an even starker picture. From 2018 to 2020, UNV, together with the International Federation of the Red Cross, led a 5-year plan of action to build evidence on the integration of volunteering into the 2030 agenda. Our research showed that over half of countries' voluntary national reviews recognize the activities of volunteers during this period, particularly in relation to service delivery, youth engagement, and disaster risk reduction. But when we look in terms of quality engagement, volunteers were involved in disseminating information and participating in surveys and other forms. They are standalone, focused on volunteering, and unable to demonstrate how volunteers are able to influence decisions or to help shape priorities and practices. In a nutshell, volunteers are implementing SDG actions, but volunteer solutions are standalone and not necessarily integrated into overall policy efforts. So this is why our next State of the World's Volunteerism report will look in more depth of how volunteerism can shape states.
I'm sorry, Emma, you froze just there. I would ask Maggie or Chris if they would like
working between volunteers and states that have the greatest potential to realize the principles of the 2030 agenda. Let me now pass on to Chris Melora, who is the lead researcher for the State of the World's Volunteerism report, to describe a bit more the methodology and process.
Thank you so much, Emma, and I hope everyone could hear me now. I'm actually here representing a consortium commissioned to research and write this year's State of the World's Volunteerism report. So just to give a bit of a background, we are composed of the UNESCO Chair in Adult Literacy and Learning for Social Transformation and the Institute for Volunteering Research, both at the University of East Anglia, Kathmandu University School of Education in Nepal, and the University of Malawi Center for Social Research. And I think all of my co-researchers are actually present today and part of the attendees. So my aim for the next 10 minutes is really to introduce to you the proposed conceptual framing that will help guide this year's State of the Volunteerism report. And a lot of the motivation behind it have already been explained in the two welcome remarks and also the keynote from Emma. But just to say that there are two conceptual starting points in this year's SWVR, and that's the concept of the evolving social contract and the framing of volunteering as people's participation. So how do we understand social contract in this research or in the SWVR? So social contracts are dynamic agreements between people and states on their mutual roles and responsibilities toward shaping and achieving the SDGs or the wider human development. But by thinking of social contracts as evolving rather than static, we recognize that power inequalities and relationships are involved in forging and maintaining these social contracts. And by thinking of volunteering as participation, this is the second concept, we think of volunteering not only as a formal service delivery mechanism, but actually it's a pathway for individuals and groups and people to engage and shape state activity through the development of the social contract. Now, oh, the next slide, it's already there. The figure that you can see on your screen now is a proposed framework for understanding the various configurations. How does state and people relationship within the context of evolving social contracts? How can that look like? And this image on your screen is our proposed model. And this was developed and adapted from the work of Leon Levine and UNDP. As you can see here, states and people, through evolving social contracts and evolving power relationships, they negotiate their changing roles towards the achievement of the SDGs. And since we recognize that power relationships exist, it means that the relationship between the state and its people is not always harmonious. And there are many different ways that it can be expressed. Now, through volunteering, there seems to be three ways by which people and state relationship could look like. The first one, as you can see in the middle circle there, is deliberation. And deliberation is the sense where people volunteer to discuss or to have a dialogue with each other and with the state to shape plans at various levels of state authority. So, for example, when you volunteer to participate in a town hall meeting, or you conduct community campaigning, or you have people led journalism. The second item there is collaboration. Now, collaboration is about action. So if deliberation is about talking and discussion and deliberation, collaboration is about collective action between people and their local or national government towards solving social issues. So examples you could think of would be co-creating and co-implementing social protection programs, for example, through community response teams or mutual aid groups. Some examples very common now during the COVID-19 crisis. And the third one is about forging effective and enduring connections. Now, this is about maintaining those relationships between peoples and states at a longer period of time and embedding volunteering practices and volunteering initiatives within government systems, but also non-government relationships and connections. So, for example, you have community health volunteers that have long been part of devolved national health system. You have national volunteering programs, neighborhood governance systems. You have local councils, climate boards, different examples of how volunteering can actually create those lasting relationships with the state. Now, we would like to encourage people to think of these three elements not as discrete boxes or separate, rather they could actually build on each other. So you start with deliberation, and then through the discussion you create an action together, and then hopefully with that action the state and people and different groups are able to develop a more long-lasting relationship. Now, within this framework, as you can see on both sides, we've kind of give a bit more explanation on people and states, because we think that different groups have different expectations and aspirations that help shape social contract. And I think that Toily has pointed this out earlier in his speech, that there are certain groups like women or perhaps young people or people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, that might face opportunities but also barriers in forming partnerships with the state through volunteering. In the same way, states also have varying institutional capacities, which could influence the way they can respond to the expectation of the communities. Now, both states and people are really, there are challenges and barriers to how they can create this relationship or social contract with each other. According to the UNDP, at the heart of a robust and evolving social contract is a strong match between people's expectations on what the state and other actors can deliver, on the one hand, and the institutional capacity available within the state and other actors to meet those expectations. So when both of these expectations kind of coincide, and that's where the robust social contract could exist. Now, within the context of the SWVR, we want to explore more centrally how evolving social contracts and emerging forms of people-state relationships could help shape actions towards the 2030 agenda. Next slide, please. Right. Yes, I'm just going to share with you the main question that animates our research, and that is, what new models of volunteering have the potential to help volunteering more effectively effectively shape a sustainable and inclusive social contract. And we do that through looking at three models: deliberative governance mechanism, co-creation of social protection and services, and social innovation models. So these are the new and emerging volunteering models and forms that we want to research in the SWVR. Next slide, please. And part of this is we're looking at evidence gaps, right? There are through the original research that we will be conducting, and this is original research that we will be commissioning, we hope to be able to fill this certain evidence gaps. Now, just to go through a little bit on them. On deliberative governance, we are keen to understand how deliberation look like in different places, particularly in global South communities. Toily was saying earlier that volunteering is a huge concept and it's understood and practiced differently in different contexts. So how do these differences play out in relation to the creation of a social contract? In terms of co-production of services, including participatory policy making, seems like there's a lot of evidence on the more technical side of co-production, like focusing on accountability, budget monitoring, etc. But we also want to look at kind of more social processes, especially issues around inclusion and voice. And finally, on innovation, we want to look at more grassroots and locally led and community-based innovation within this particular report. Okay, so just the final slide, Katrina. I guess some of the questions that you want to pose to the participants today is, does the framing make sense? And is there anything missing from our framework? Please give us your any advice or any feedback, because at the next stage, we're going to develop the full framing paper and commission the research. And during the rest of this webinar, we're going to listen to experts who's going to give us really good examples on their work on this area. And hopefully that will help us to sharpen our framework. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Chris and Emma, for that framing presentation. I think we now have what we need to move to the next portion of this webinar, which is the roundtable discussion, where we would hear experiences, real experiences, examples, and ideas from our experts and also from grassroots volunteer groups. Whenever people feel like joining the discussion, please use the Q&A section, and then later on during our discussion in about half an hour or so, we would select the best ones for the discussion. Okay, so with that, let's hear first from the experience of Ms. Jalil Ann Burao, who's the co-founder of the Citizen Budget Tracker, who is tracking the budgetary allocations of the government for COVID response. Let's see her short video intervention.
Hello, I'm Jalil Barao of the Citizens Budget Tracker of the Philippines. We are a community effort of 60 plus volunteers who hold power to account by tracking the COVID budget of the Philippines. We have now expanded our work by building a community of budget advocates within civil society organizations and other social movements. Within our group, we have our core work that included organizing to track all COVID-19 programs and to maintain a website that shows how the budget is spent. We also organized for a responsive COVID budget and proposed some measures so there's more transparency in reporting the spending. We also organized with journalists and advocates to report the truth about the budget. Our project-based research also includes organizing scholars to open up more contracting data and reviewing procurement data. We also organized with local communities to verify social amelioration beneficiaries, and we've organized with local governments so that they can open their local budgets and share that with their citizens. So today we hope to share what we've learned with other community organizers so they can lobby for more budget resources in the respective sectors, such as transport, health, and education. So my question is two parts. Number one, what are the practical ways for citizens to effectively participate in shaping public policy? And if they are to participate, what are the skills and competencies that citizens need to have so that they can effectively dialogue with their governments? And how can we democratize these skills so that more people can have them and more people can participate? Thank you so much.
So thank you. That was Jalil Ann Borao from the Philippines, who's asking like, what exactly, how can citizens influence policy making? And now we will hear from Ms. Cielo Morales, who will respond to these questions using her experiences and her research from Latin America. Over to you, Cielo.
Thank you very much. And I would like, well, first of all, appreciate and thank the invitation for this very, very interesting conversation. It resonated so much on me, the words of the opening remarks, both of Emma, Jean Conceição, and particularly the research that you are undertaking and the words of Chris Milari, and the open budget experience. So I wanted to, I don't know if you can see my presentation, my first slide. Yes. Well, first of all, I'm sure you are very much familiar with this phrase, nothing about us without us. This phrase was convened by the feminist movement, but I think it's applicable and is a feeling of all groups that have been excluded traditionally from policymaking and in the planning processes from state, and the ones who have had no voice in raising their own concerns. So let's try to see how we can put at the center of the planning and policy making who are those groups that have been lagging behind traditionally. So I would like to raise two examples of planning, participatory planning and policymaking in Latin America and the Caribbean. One from the regional perspective and the other one very much centered in a planning process undertaken by Guatemala, which I think is a very good example of how can community and citizens' participation can be brought to the institution, institutionalized, as we say. So the next, my next slide, please. Okay, we all know that policy making is a multi-stage cycle, but these different stages have been very much influenced, particularly the first one, the definition of the problem or the definition of the public agenda, has been strongly influenced by the social movements that rallies public issues, particularly nowadays with a more empowered citizenship. Even though public problems are very well known, I mean, poverty, inequality, gender inequality, all type of inequality, employment, fiscal constraints, and so on. These problems extend over time, transcending government cycles, but the timing for addressing them and the recognition of key players for debating public policies to tackle all these problems, particularly those who have voice and representation, such as those that are not visible, is now much more important than a purely technocratic analysis. In other words, the political operation of public policy, precisely because of the rupture of the state's monopoly on public management, is vital. So in this sense, the complexity of the definition of the public agenda that precedes the policy design is its dynamisms and requires a lot of flexibility. And as Chris was saying, maintaining a constant reading of the context, recognition of the interest at stake, because all stakeholders have their own particular interest, as well as the asymmetry of power between social actors, always maintaining the principle of inclusion and participation. It's vital for the definition of the public agenda. So what we can say is that in the 21st century, public policy is designed increasingly open to the participation of citizens, not only in levels of information, but a binding opinion and particularly social control. Let's move then to the regional example on open government, a paradigm for public management with the participation of civil society. I think it's very extremely important because the example that just we heard on open budget, just to have a monitoring, a social auditing and social monitoring of what it's been spent for COVID, as it was presented from the Philippines, the example, is what is open government all about. In Latin America, it's been almost a decade since the open government partnership started in 2010, that it was approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So it's been a decade, and already 16 Latin American and Caribbean countries have implemented 42 open government plans and 1,156 commitments. So what is this all about? An open government puts citizens at the center of its work and its decisions. It's open to the world, co-innovates, as Chris was saying, with all, especially with citizens, harnesses the power of massive collaboration, makes transactions and government transactions and operations much more transparent, and works in an integrated and networked manner. An open government action plan led by the national government must foster a multi-stakeholder co-creation process involving the civil society in the prioritization and definition of commitments under the pillars of the open government, which are transparency, participation, and collaboration. So the main objective of an action plan is to serve as a policy instrument for improving the level and quality of openness of public institutions. So I think it's very important that we already know that it's already there. I mean, openness, before it was an option. Now it's very much compulsory. And this is what citizenship are really claiming nowadays. So what are the regional trends in co-creation processes of these plans? First of all, several mechanisms are used: face-to-face consultations, information and awareness, and so on. Second, decentralization of co-creation processes, very much taken to the territorial level, local level. Third, monitoring of commitments is very open, citizens boards, tracking panels. Fourth, linking action commitments to the 2030 agenda, which is really important because it is about how the goals and targets are already in place and hopefully achieved. In my last slide, if we can change it, okay. This is the example of Guatemala. It's a national example, and the building of the Cartoon 2032. Our Guatemala is what they say, Nuestra Guatemala, which is already a very inclusive concept. And in this plan, I would like to raise it because it's a very good example of how, with the political will of a national government, participation, citizens' participation can be institutionalized. First of all, I'm not going to get into details of what are the main development actions and so on, because it's already there in information. But I think the most important thing here is how it was built. And the process, the participatory process, took about 2 years, where more than 381 events were held, national and citizens dialogues, forum and workshops, participation of urban and rural national councils, urban and rural regional councils, departmental, I mean, all levels of the territory participated, meaning more than 13 and 39 men and women from all sectors, civil society, academia, private sector, and so on. A very inclusive, frank, and open process. Why is this important? Because it tends to be sustainable and it promotes ownership of whatever is said in this plan. Priorities are already transcended this government cycle that initiated this process. Now there is a change of government. It started last year, and the government plan is based on the same long-term vision of this national development plan. These are two different examples, one from the regional arena, and the second one from the national arena. I'm sorry, my dogs are getting mad. So I'm sorry about this, but this is my last slide. It is possible. It is possible. Participation was before optional, now is we cannot conceive policymaking or planning without the participation of citizens and more ample participation of all sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shelo, for that very inspiring presentation. So we've heard some examples from Latin America, but now let's move. I'll take you back again to Asia, to Southeast Asia, to hear the example from Thailand, clean air. We'll see what happens there when people really mobilize and participate. Let's see her video.
Hi, my name is Weena. I'm a financial economist and a sustainability professional. I started the Thailand Clean Air Network about 2.5 years ago now. So we are a grassroots, multidisciplinary and cross-organizational group of people who basically got together because the air quality really deteriorated here, particularly in Bangkok. We wanted to find policy-led solutions by leveraging the skill sets that we have together to try to solve this problem. In Southeast Asia, I think, particularly in Thailand, active citizenship isn't something people are familiar with. I mean, it's having a sense that what they can do can create a difference. I think that there is a sort of fatalistic kind of sense that, you know, whatever I do, it's not going to be much of an impact. So people are more, you know, they know the air pollution is bad. So their initial instinct is always to, let's go there and buy air purifier. Let's go and, you know, buy that plant or buy that gadget. But they don't think, okay, let me be part of the solution. So that's been a challenge. And now let me just maybe pose the question for the expert. And that's going back to what I've just raised, which is the issue of, you know, how do you actually bring about active citizenship, particularly in a climate like, you know, Southeast Asia, where it's not, in Thailand, where really it's not the norm. People don't really, you know, galvanize and, you know, come together to push on things. I mean, there are some aspects people do galvanize on, obviously, because we now have a fair amount of protests on the street. But on certain issues, I think there's a sense of like, well, you know, I'm such a small individual, I can't really influence anything. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways, because if everybody believes that, you know, what I say or what I ask for doesn't make a difference, people don't ask. And by not asking, you will get, you know, a society that doesn't fulfill, that doesn't have these issues that concern you being addressed.
Yes, so we saw the other side of the story there, where in some regions of the world, people are still, although actually Clean Air Thailand was able to mobilize enough people to make some changes in the clean air policy in Thailand, it is still a struggle to get people do something. So so now I'm going to hand over to Christina to try to respond to her questions regarding to how can we bring about this active citizenship? How can we influence social norms? And what is the role of volunteerism? Over to you, Christina.
Thank you very much, Katrina. And thanks for the question. It's really an excellent question and very much related to both our topics at UNV and also at the Human Development Report Office, especially for our report last year. So volunteering is directly related to agency, and that is one of the key concepts of the human development approach. With agency, we mean actions for change. So people do something to generate the change they want to see. And that is crucial for changing social norms. And in our report, we describe how social norms are things that people deem appropriate in a given society and mostly during a given time, because that can change, as Pedro already said, very quickly sometimes. For example, in the Western world, a handshake was the common norm of salutation. until the onset of the pandemic last year. Nowadays, hardly anyone shakes hands anymore, at least for now, and that can change again. And most people follow social norms just because that is what everybody does, or they believe that it's accepted in society and everybody will do the same thing. So more people join, and that's how social norms become reinforcing. The thing is that many social norms are detrimental for our planet. And just to give a few examples, littering on the street instead of using a recycling bin, or idling the car in the winter in the morning, or using plastic bags or disposable dishes instead of reusable bags when you go shopping. So these norms need to be changed. But there's also in every society something that we call a status quo conserving effect. And that pushes for social norms to be maintained in society. And that can be either, it can be because of different interests, either because from the private sector, there's pressure because it's profitable, or from the people because it's convenient for some. So what we need is another pushing force that wants to change the social norms. And we believe that volunteering can be one of these pushing forces, or any other form of active participation in a civil society organization, for example. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in detail in a second, but I think you have another question for me, right, Katrina?
I think that's, yes, so basically the questions would be around like, how can we influence social norms? And yeah, especially in terms of policy making and how to bring people together and really try to make a difference.
Okay, so for that, I'm gonna share my screen. You should be able to see it now, right? Okay, great. Okay, so this is mainly to show you some figures from our 2020 Human Development Report. So one of the questions that we ask ourselves in the report is, how do social norms change then? What do we need to change them, and how do they actually work? And for that, we have to look at how they are actually formed. And let me see, I think you can, oh, okay. So on this figure here, this is a figure from our report, you can see how social norms are formed out of values, and that starts actually with a learning process. And with the learning process, we refer to education and the formal education system, but it can also be learning during childhood at home from parents or relatives, or learning in adulthood at the job, or through social media, or any other impacts or context and stimuli that one can get. And then values are formed. And in the report, we present some striking statistics that actually, you can see that here on the slide, that almost 80% of the people think that protecting the planet is important. And that is data from the World Value Survey. And what you see here is not a correlation. Those are different countries. And what we want to say with that is that these 80% on average, that is across all countries that were part of the sample, about 60, and across all categories of human development. So this is not just a rich country phenomenon or specific countries. This is overall in the world, and 80% is quite high, we think. So the thing with this, when we look at this graph again, is that, well, actually, I'm going to show this slide first, because there is another striking statistic. So we have the 80% that think it is important to protect the planet, but then what you see here is on average about 50% only who actually think that they will actively do something to protect the planet and implement the change they would like to see. and believe in. And there are some examples of what these people would do, and you can see that here on the slide. So we identified this gap between the values that people hold and the actual action that they do. And let me then go back to this slide. So down here, you can see agency. So that's where the people actually act and do something to change social norms, which are which is less likely, what we just saw in the statistic, than the people who do hold these values. And that can have several explanations. So there are other factors that feed in here, which is the private sector, as I already said, with some interested government, civil society, also some persistent habits and situational factors and facilitating conditions. With that, we mean policies then that can either foster action to protect the planet or impede in some cases also. And then to come back to the role of volunteers. So we believe that volunteers act as agents for change. And that is actually one of the missing links between values and social norms. So we just identified that we need action for change, we need agency. And volunteering can be a platform for collective agency, because volunteering is a space where like-minded people meet and exchange ideas and also, most importantly, take action. And they do that at a collective level. So that can spread out to other people, and people follow the examples that volunteers provide and with their action. And then we can actually generate this change in social norms that we were looking for, because then the social norm become reinforcing and more people join. And we think that this is actually a form of empowerment of the people who can act upon their values within their volunteering setting, but also of other people who can then follow these social norms that become normal in society. And this is actually where individual action, or in this case, also action within a group, within a volunteering group, can have a high potential for society-wide impact. Thank you very much. That's it from my side.
Thank you so much, Christina. And and now we're going to hear from a volunteer. So thank you for giving us that link from having social norms and what is the role of volunteering to actually implement those changes or be that change. So we're going to hear from a volunteer from Egypt who will talk about her experiences with the World Health Organization, especially and pose a question to Mr. Ilchong.
Hi, my name is Nada and I'm a UN volunteer at the Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office for the World Health Organization. I help develop communications and raising awareness campaigns for international days like the World AIDS Day, World Malaria Day, World Immunization Week, and World TB Day. What I found inspiring in these campaigns is how volunteers who are mostly ordinary people, young and old, men and women, coming from all walks of life, come together on the issues that affect them. I feel inspired with their passion and motivation to act quickly and selflessly. They also show willingness to do more. People of all ages and backgrounds want to share their voices and their visions with those people making decisions. But the question is how? As institutions, we have become very good at partnerships with communities to share information or to raise awareness. But how do we take the next step to collaborate? How can volunteers and citizens be meaningfully involved in solutions for a healthier world?
Yes, so this question is for you, Ilchong. So how can we co-produce these services? What types of innovation and solidarity is needed?
Thank you, Nada. Very interesting question. I mean, before I give the answer to your question, I mean, I'd like to share my thought about kind of basic service you are dealing with, and deliberative governance you emphasized. Would you upload my slide, please? I cannot see my slide. Here, yes. So I think when you change the situation, I think it is quite important to tell yourself to start suspecting all those institutions and ideologies making this mess we have. So maybe my first question or my first suspect about everything we have is what basic service is for. I mean, is it for meeting the needs only, or is it expanding the freedom while meeting the needs? I mean, the conventional understanding about providing basic needs or meeting the needs through basic service is to satisfy the needs of people. But it is not enough, because all those problems we have, for instance, inequality and all those disparities, are based on the kind of a discrepancy between a vast majority of people meeting the needs and people who don't have anything to do to meet their needs. So we have to go beyond the kind of a target or goal of meeting the needs. We have to focus on how to expand the freedom while meeting the needs. And when you are dealing with, provision of basic service, you must have come across the word like a co-production of service. But what is this co-production of service for? I mean, is it for efficient production of services, or is it for empowerment and capability enhancement of people producing services? I think the latter is the answer, because if you just focus on efficient production of services, I think you can reduce the capacity and capability of people to generate more basic services for more people. So I think, again, we have to kind of go beyond the kind of low target or low goal or low hanging fruit, like an efficient production of services as a goal, to go to the kind of bigger goal, like empowerment and capability enhancement of people producing services. So is there any that kind of model to expand the freedom and to enhance the kind of a power or capability of people producing services? Yes, there is. I'd like to share my answer or my idea about that kind of solution. Next slide, please. There is a kind of alternative approach called social and solidarity economy. It refers to economic relations and activities that prioritize social and often environmental objectives. And basically, it creates and organizes practices for democratic self-management, solidarity, and active citizenship in economic relations and activities. So in a nutshell, it is fundamentally about reasserting social control, which means social activities to enhance freedom over the economy by giving primacy to social and environmental objectives above profits. So around yourself, I mean, you can find many different types of organizations which can be encompassed as social economy, like cooperatives, mutual associations, community organizations, self-help groups, and so on and so on. And those organizations showed its resilience and their kind of capacities and capabilities in the midst of pandemics. Next slide, please. I think those organizations showed three kind of distinctive advantages or kind of features compared to other market fundamental and growth-oriented and methodologically individualistic organizational form of activities, economic activities. First of all, they kind of expanded solidarity within the organization to local community. You have so many kind of examples, such as kind of organizations raising social awareness through the campaigns and producing and delivering personal protection equipments across several reasons beyond the organizations. And sometimes they kind of waive the fees and rents to their rentiers of housing properties. And if it is a bank, they kind of postponed interest payments and repayments on loans. I mean, if you compare these activities with traditional economic organizations seeking profits, you can see the difference between these organizations and conventional economic organizations. And second distinctive feature of these organizations is they are working on essential sectors. They kind of major players behind the show must go on. Even though they are working on essential sectors and they got low paid, they kind of continue to work maintaining self-management, democratic self-management principles and solidarity values. So they could continue the kind of basic functions of society without losing important values of democratic self-management and solidarity values. Lastly, they could flexibly transform their organizational nature into kind of different organizational forms to effectively respond to pandemics. For instance, there were so many savings groups in developing countries, and they were transformed into the groups for primary healthcare training and distribution network of cash transfer benefits. So there are so many episodes, but I think I'd like to emphasize for volunteers. I mean, if you are involved in helping somebody to meet the basic needs, I think you shouldn't, or we shouldn't, stop at providing basic needs and meeting basic needs. I mean, we have to go beyond meeting basic needs to expand the freedom of people who get the benefits from all of us. So I think that is the kind of idea behind kind of a new social contract. I mean, we have to aim high and set the goals high to go beyond all those conventional goals and targets which shape this mess we have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Inchang, for that wonderful presentation. I think at the very start, Toily Korbanov also challenged us to go beyond just painting some pictures here and there, but actually really trying to unpack these things. What does this mean? And one of this, as we move along this webinar or this consultation, we see that one of the threads that we keep hearing is this deliberative governance, is co-creation, this Cielo's quote there, nothing about us without us. And usually the people who are left behind are young people. So in our next intervention, we would hear from Madagascar, Ms. Maria Cristina Colo, who is a climate activist, social entrepreneur. And let's hear her intervention.
So, hi everyone, my name is Maria Cristina Kulu. I'm 32 years old and I'm a climate activist, a green social entrepreneur, and an eco-feminist from Madagascar. In the last 5 years, we were able, my team and I, to launch several products, but COVID-19 challenged us a lot. But as young, optimistic youth, even during this difficult time, we created an eco-friendly and solidarity soap called Alt Soap. It is made from waste cooked oil, and we also create a prototype of no-rinse soap to reach the most vulnerable people who do not have access to soap and water. Actually, in Madagascar, 3 out of 4 people do not have access to soap and water. So even during the pandemic, we were able to create more than 12 jobs to vulnerable people. I'm convinced that young people can bring positive change. I'm from a country where the majority of the population is under 30. More than 70% of our population is under 30. But we are not heard, we are not listened, we are not in the decision-making space, whereas we are the majority. And I don't know exactly the context in Wales, but my question would be how how the the government there is able to bring youth on the table. How do they do that? How we can reduce this this inequality, this lack of representation? I don't.
Yes, so that's Marie-Christine Nicolo from Madagascar. And I'm very sorry, Jacob, but you got the most difficult question to answer. It was very basic. How can you actually involve the youth? But please go ahead, share us your examples and experiences.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon and greetings from Wales, a small nation with big ambitions. Today is a significant day. Although my role is centered around looking forward and preparing for a better future, I hope you can forgive me as I begin my response to the question by looking to the past. Involving citizens in decision-making, policy development, and social change is the most profound thing we can do as democratic institutions. On this day in 2010, President Obama signed the US Healthcare Reform Bill in law, a bill which was campaigned for and led by multiple generations and hailed as the most expansive social legislation in decades. In contrast, on this day, the Enabling Act of 1933 granted Adolf Hitler dictatorial powers, paving the way for one of history's biggest clampdowns on involvement, engagement, and civil liberties. It's also on this day in 2019 that more than 1 million marched to demand a new European Union referendum in London, a signal that involvement is complex. And in the harshest of truths, in recent weeks, the UK government are seeking to pass the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which will set restrictions on the ability of organisations and individuals to protest. In fact, the bill proposes limits on how noisy they are and on the impact protests can have on communities. This move is one of many across the world which seeks to challenge the importance of involvement and citizen voice. And finally, considering the hosts of today's event, it would be remiss of me not to wish the UN World Meteorological Organization a happy birthday, as it was established on this day in 1950. But of course, perhaps the most relevant date for me to mention today is that of March 23rd, 2020, 1 year ago today. The UK went into lockdown forced by COVID-19. And if ever there was a moment that highlighted the importance of youth and civic involvement, the last year has offered us that exploration in abundance. But with the past in our minds, let's now look ahead. And if I can have the next slide, please. Wales is rich in youth activism and representation. Here are a few of the organisations that are ensuring the voices of young people are central to service design and policy development. The Urdd there in the centre is our largest youth movement in Wales and represents over 50,000 members. And as a charity trustee of Scouts Cymru, I'm proud of the work we're doing to ensure that young people have the necessary skills for life. I too want to pay my tribute to the hundreds of thousands of youth organisations globally who have adapted and responded to the volatile and uncertain world around them as a result of COVID-19. I commend their versatility, perseverance, and support for young people during this difficult time. And why am I so passionate about involvement in young people? Well, from a young age, as chair of the school council, its school head prefect, a president of a students' union, and the presenter of a children and young people's BBC News programme, I value the need for ensuring youth voice had a platform. But perhaps surprisingly, I've dedicated my time in the last 3 years to the voices and needs of those not yet born, our future generations. How do you ensure we involve the unborn in our decision making, I hear you ask? A demographic which has no voice, a vote, or any visibility. Next slide, please. This graphic illustrates the scope, I hope, for you. There are currently around 7.7 billion people. That's the green dot in the middle there. And over the next 50,000 years, there are going to be around 6.75 trillion people that make it through. Young people and those not yet born will be amongst the ones who will be most impacted by natural disasters caused by climate change, food and water shortages, biodiversity loss, destruction of ecosystems, the climate refugee crisis, and future health pandemics. We must do more to involve them and advocate for their needs. Next slide, please. And that's why in 2015, Wales became the first country to enshrine in law the principles of ensuring that policy decisions meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I've just had a flag of 2 minutes. That's a quick 5 minutes. And this act places a legal duty on all our public institutions to promote sustainable development. And it's also a legislation that is championed and adopted by the voluntary sector in Wales. Next slide, please. The goals have a connection between the Sustainable Development Goals, and there you have them on the screen there, and Wales is the only country to have legislated in this way. Next slide, please. There are 5 ways of working illustrated. Apologies, they're small on the screen there, but that one on the bottom is very important. Involvement, it doesn't say consultation, it doesn't say engagement, it says involvement. And every public body must consider how they involve young people and all generations in their decisions. Next slide, please. And then the Act establishes this exciting role, the role of a Future Generations Commissioner, the only role of its type in the world. This is Sophie Howe, this is my boss, and she has the role of advocating for the needs of and the interests of those not yet born. Next slide, please. These are some of the resources. Wales was the first country in the UK to establish the role of a Children's Commissioner, has adopted the UNCRC into law, advocating therefore for the rights and the well-being of children. The slides are available and I'll share the resources possibly after today. Next slide, please. There are 4 examples then of how we are using or advocating for the rights and the voice of involving young people. That's top left, we have our Welsh Youth Parliament. So these are young people representing other young people across Wales, advocating on our biggest issues, sitting here in our parliament here in Wales and taking on some of the big issues to our government and other parliamentarians in Wales. For the first time on the right there, top right, first time in May in our national elections, 16 and 17-year-olds will have the ability to vote. I do personally advocate for lowering the age even further, but this is the first time that 16 and 17-year-olds will have the opportunity. Bottom right is the, so since 2005, it has been a requirement for schools to set up school councils. I mentioned I was a chair and a member of mine in school. And I think this is an important opportunity to at a young age talk about how children can raise issues that they care about in a safe environment and starting to build up their courage to talk about their issues more broadly. And then bottom left, youth climate ambassadors, not unique, of course, to Wales, but I think that there's been a big push and across our voluntary sectors in giving rights to young people. Next slide, please. Next one again. So my final 2 slides. Why is building a movement important? Why is including young people important in decision making? Well, we have to answer these questions. So who has the ideas? And I think young people have some of the best ideas going forward. What the problem is not giving them an opportunity to express them. Who has to live with the consequences of decisions that are being made? Well, it's young people, so include them in your decisions. Who is connected? And what we mean here is the digital connection, of course, but also those social connections in our communities. And our young people are so vital in that space. And then who are visible. I've just shown you one example of where children are turning to the streets as part of the climate crisis. And I think that they are increasingly becoming vocal and becoming much more aware of the issues around them. And then just in the COVID context, looking back over the last year of young people being involved in some of our response, and students being asked to who are nursing students, for example, who are not yet qualified, going into the profession early in order to help out in our services. And of course, voluntary organisations like Scouts Cymru, who I mentioned earlier, going out into the community and helping our vulnerable. Those people are passionate and they believe in a better way of doing things. My final slide, please. Thank you. So here are some of the examples of how you can meaningfully put young people as part of decision making. So we're advocating in the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for a real life fast track. And that means how can we bring not just young people, but in this case, young people into government, helping to advise them as experts on different policy development. So if you're a young carer, you should be involved in helping shape carers policy across Wales and beyond. Reverse mentoring is so important. How can we flip the system to ensure that those young people who have got expertise in a variety of areas are mentoring those in positions of power and influence to improve their decisions. Create spaces is the third one for young people. So we devise something called a People's Platform. It's a digital space, but of course not everyone's able to be in those digital spaces. So create the spaces. Don't assume that young people will come to you. I think you've got to be able to create these welcoming places for young people. Be open, honest and transparent with children and young people. If anything, over the last year, young people are becoming much more savvy, much more understanding and empathetic about decisions, but you have to treat them with the respect that deserves and include them in those decision makings on a variety of issues. A seat at the table, that can often become quite tokenistic, but I think there's a challenge that we have to give to all our decision makers, all levels of society, why there isn't young people around the table. Apply that intersectional lens. So don't just tick the box by saying you've got a young person, but expand that. Not just thinking about a white male who's a young person at the table. There are so many other colourful people, creative people that need to be included. Broaden your understanding of a young person. It isn't just a white male. As you, I'm sure, are fully aware. And then finally, the intergenerational fight. I mentioned future generations, they don't have a voice, but I don't want us to silo our thinking into young people against older people. I think there is something much more powerful in seeing this as an intergenerational fight that bridge generations together, and therefore we'll have much more respect for the decisions that they come up with. And finally, young people have views on everything, not just on issues that relate to young people. So don't silo their thinking into one area. They have answers, solutions, ideas, and radical thoughts about how we can transform all policy areas across our societies. So I hope, Maria, I'm able to answer your question specifically and shared a little bit of the approach here in Wales. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I'm sure you answered the question very comprehensively, for sure. But for sure, we can go on and on about this as well, because there's so many issues that you pointed out, so many questions. As we also see in the chat box and also in the Q&A, there are a lot of questions coming from different participants. But as we don't really have much time, I will compile the questions and then reach out to each one of you. In the meantime, I would like to hand over to Maggie. Yes.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you very much, and to all of our speakers today. That's right, we've had a lot of interesting and challenging questions. Let me just read a few of those out, not that we have time to respond to them here and now, but they're really going to help us to shape our report as we move forward. So a big question we heard from many young volunteers, young activists today, and I think a big question that was coming out, we heard from Stevie and others, how can we value much more and respect young people's work? So that's very relevant to what Jacob was just saying from Wales. We would love to hear more from other countries, other contexts, about ways in which we can involve young people much more meaningfully, given how active they are on the issues that affect them. a number of questions really about how we apply the model and the research for the report to different contexts. So from Carmen, for example, she was asking about in Latin America, but in general, in fragile contexts, this idea of the social contract and matching expectations between citizens and states, and how can volunteers help to strengthen that? You know, especially where government capacities may be limited in order to meet expectations of people. I think one question which came out, which was very relevant to Il-Chion's presentation, there was a question about large corporations, private sector corporations, conglomerates. What's their role in the global reset? And does volunteering help us to shape some of the norms that Christina talked about, and so on and so forth, beyond the social and solidarity economy kind of organizations and institutions that Il-Chion was introducing to us. And maybe finally from Bunama, asked, how can we fill some of these evidence gaps, particularly in different contexts? We started off talking about human development, but where actors may not be focused on human development per se. So how can we really talk openly about volunteering and the social contract and gather the evidence and the research that we need to help ensure that volunteers and others are able to participate meaningfully? So as Katrina says, time is not on our side, and it's very difficult to summarize such a rich discussion. But the good news is that the conversation doesn't stop here. This is just our first consultation as we develop the next State of the World's Volunteerism report. So firstly, I hope that you will see the fruits of our discussion already in the framing paper, which is the summary paper, which we will release in a few weeks, which will reflect many of your comments, questions, and challenges. In terms of what I'm taking away as the project coordinator, I think today's discussion confirmed that there's a lot of interest. We had plenty of people online today, and this is a relevant and timely subject. What I've also taken away, what this has confirmed, is that there are models out there that we as UNV, with our research, together with you all, can learn from. So whether that's in Guatemala, as Cielo talked about, dialogue and different fora for a national conversation and participatory policymaking, to social and solidarity economy models in India. So this is what we really need to look at and to start to unpack real life examples where volunteers are able to start shaping expectations and roles under an evolving social contract. I think what challenged me, and of course we didn't have as much time as we would have liked, we know that really there's a diversity of volunteering types. There were a number of questions about activism, for example. Where does this fit into the research, the report? Short-term versus long-term, what time frame are we really thinking about when we're talking about meaningful change? And then, you know, whether that's now and obviously into the future. And then a number of comments and questions from you all about power dynamics, intersectionality, really bringing out the kind of granularity of some of these issues and how they affect real people's lives. In terms of what was new, I think we've already started to identify some blind spots or some areas that we need to develop further, particularly based on the interventions from our experts. So for example, not only focusing on actions and practices, but also wider norms beyond you know, the normal volunteering, but norms of solidarity, how we move from this individual agency to collective action. And definitely this idea of the role of the private sector. If we have a 21st century social contract, we need to really bring in the complexities of our societies, politics and economies. So finally, what's next? I think, Katrina, we have a slide. We're in contact with all of you now via this webinar. The first proposal is that we will take all of the questions that we've received today, and we have an online dialogue on UNV's knowledge portal, knowledge.unv.org. And my colleagues will help us to collect your questions, and then while we have you on the spot, I will ask our panelists if you wouldn't mind answering the questions that are relevant to you, and we'll take the discussion online, because I think there's some very interesting conversations to be had. You'll need to register on the knowledge portal, but you'll find the link is on the screen right now, and it should take you through under the knowledge exchange. As I said, we already heard some very interesting potential case studies for the State of the World's Volunteerism report. And if you have any further case studies, it would be great if you could submit them to Chris. His email is on the screen on behalf of the consortium, the team that he talked about earlier. And this will help us really to shape our primary research for the report. We'll also, this is the first dialogue, this is the first conversation, but we envisage a number throughout the year on some of the themes that we've picked up today and others. And if you're interested in continuing the conversation with us, you can see my email, margaret.carroll@unv.org, and please be in touch and we can think about how to work together. And we'll also publish details of any forthcoming events, dialogues or conversations in different regions on the knowledge portal. So we have a lot to do. We have a lot to take on board based on your inputs, and we'll work towards the report of the State of the World's Volunteerism 2021 for International Volunteer Day this year, which is the 5th of December. And we look forward to continuing the conversation and for the support of all of the speakers, the volunteers who recorded the videos, and of course, those of you who joined today for our meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good day to all of you.